This dog waited 10 years for its owner. What happened next is heartbreaking. It started on a hollow, wind-swept day, so cold that the air felt sharp enough to slice the skin. In the corner of a cramped, sun-faded porch sat a small dog, his ears perked forward, gaze fixed on the distant driveway as though each passing second promised a grand homecoming. The shape of his body, rigid yet trembling, hinted at a mounting hope on the brink of heartbreak. If someone looked close enough, they might have noticed his dark eyes glimmering with a haunted eagerness, punctuated by a question so profound it seemed etched into his very bones. When will he come back? Even though the house behind him was dark, its paint peeling off in strips from years of neglect, and even though the neighborhood had slowly transformed into a place of silent departures and swift farewells, the dog refused to abandon his post. Neighbors rarely caught his name. Some called him Buddy, others Duke. But each morning, anyone passing by recognized the same image. A loyal canine stationed at the porch's edge, front paws perched on the top step, nose lifted expectantly toward the road. Many assumed he must be waiting for someone who had simply stepped out on an errand. Perhaps the man of the house had gone to buy groceries or pick up a child. Days turned into weeks, though, and the dog never strayed far. He might wander off briefly to relieve himself or sniff out scraps behind a toppled trash can, but before anyone could blink, he'd hurry back to his spot, that invisible tether of hope snapping him to attention. Weeks melted into months, and when the man never returned, rumors began to brew. Some whispered that the dog's owner had moved away in a hurry, leaving the poor creature behind. Others believed the dog was waiting for someone taken by tragedy, a casualty of an accident or a sudden illness. And the dog, faithful to the last breath, had not grasped the concept of final goodbyes. A few compassionate souls tried to coax him away. They'd offer him treats, warm blankets, the promise of a loving home, but the dog wouldn't budge. He'd accept a morsel of kindness, wag his tail in gratitude, but the moment they tried to lead him off the porch, he would back up, whimpering softly as if to say, "This is where he'll find me. I must stay." Ultimately, it became clear. This dog was determined to wait. In the first year of his vigil, the dog was relatively young. He had a sleek coat of mottled browns and blacks, and neighbors occasionally glimpsed him bounding around in a burst of youthful energy. Yet he always returned to that same step, as though tethered to a memory that replayed endlessly in his mind. Children on the street grew fond of him. They'd gather by the fence, pressing their small faces against it, calling the dog over to play. He would trot toward them, tail wagging, but always paused if he got too far from that porch. A flicker of worry, maybe a question. What if I'm gone and he comes back? And he would race back to his post. Time, as it always does, continued its steady march. Seasons unfurled one after the other. Winters were harsh. Snow fell in thick layers, biting at the dog's paws and freezing the tip of his nose. Summers brought scorching sunbeams that pressed down on the asphalt like a hot iron. Through all of it, the dog remained watchful. He found shade beneath the rotted porch steps in summer and curled into a tight ball behind a broken door in winter. Neighbors tried to help with old blankets, bowls of water, and scraps of food, anything to keep him nourished. Yet, the dog never truly accepted any place other than that stoop. The slightest noise or movement in the distance drew him out, ears forward, tail trembling in anticipation. One day, toward the end of the second year, a woman named took pity. She had moved into the neighborhood recently, unaware of the dog's long-held vigil. At first, she thought he was a stray, rummaging through the remains of his old home. But soon she heard the stories, how he had been there for so long, how attempts to help him had all faltered. Couldn't stand the heartbreak of it. She'd visit every morning, offering a fresh bowl of water and bits of leftover chicken or beef from her fridge. Slowly, the dog warmed up to her. His wagging tail became a morning greeting she anticipated with a strange joy. Though he ate her food, she noticed he never fully relaxed around her. There was always a cautious glance over his shoulder, a gentle whining in his throat that suggested he might be letting her down if he got too friendly. It was as if the dog's heart had set aside every shred of loyalty for the one person who was not there. Desperate to help, canvassed the neighborhood to see if anyone knew how to get in touch with the missing owner. Yet the further she searched, the more the trail vanished. The house had been boarded up, mail piled at the front door, unopened and now mostly disintegrated. The official records, from what little she could learn, hinted that the home's occupant had once been a solitary man named Aaron who'd been in an accident some years back. No one seemed to know more details, only that he had no local family and that the accident had been severe. Some said he'd been taken to a hospital out of state. Others speculated that he'd died. One neighbor recalled an ambulance in the middle of the night, faint sirens fading in the dark. But all of it was rumor, fragmented recollections, possibly confounded by the passage of time. Confronted a dilemma. If the owner had passed, the dog was waiting in vain. But how could she pull him from that porch against his will? Every attempt to place a leash on him or carry him away ended in frantic squirms and high-pitched cries. Once he even wriggled free of the leash, bolting back to the house with a speed she had never seen. He scratched at the battered front door, whining with an almost human desperation. Stood there, tears in her eyes, understanding in an instant that the dog was living by an unwavering rule. He must remain at the last place he saw his human, because that's where he was told to wait. Soon enough, more people felt compelled to intervene. A local animal rescue group heard the story and arrived one afternoon in a white van, equipped with cages and gentle snares. Their leader, an older man with kind eyes, knelt on the porch, trying to coax the dog toward him with softly spoken words and slices of hot dog. The dog tentatively approached but froze at the threshold. He sniffed the treat, then looked back at the front door. Moments later, he sank down on his haunches as if acknowledging a sorrowful truth. "I can't leave." The rescue team exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. They feared the dog might starve in the winter or succumb to the sweltering summer heat if he stayed. But every rescue strategy, they knew, would involve removing him from his post. They tried a final time, but the dog darted off into the yard. After several more attempts, they left a phone number with, instructing her to call if she spotted any injury or if the dog's health began to decline drastically. For now, they felt they could do no more without causing him severe distress. Time stretched onward, unwavering in its pace. Halfway through the third year, the dog had grown thinner. Gray fur flecked the edges of his muzzle. He remained steadfast, but the edges of his eyes carried a dullness that hadn't been there before. The children who once came to visit him were older now, some already entering high school, their interests pivoting from the friendly neighborhood dog to the swirl of teenage life. A few still remembered, though. They would pass by on their way to the bus, giving a soft wave or calling out a gentle greeting. The dog always wagged his tail, but the sorrow in his posture was undeniable. Redoubled her efforts, placing a sturdier shelter near the porch. Just a small doghouse under the so he could stay warm. She even paid a handyman to repair a portion of the rotted porch, making it safer for him to lie upon. The dog seemed thankful in the only way he knew how, resting near her feet and letting out a soft sigh whenever she was near. She couldn't shake the feeling that he recognized her kindness, but could not reciprocate beyond a certain point. His heart was, and always would be, somewhere else. Somewhere locked away with the memory of the person who had once lived in that house. By the start of the fourth year, the battered home, unclaimed and abandoned, became a target for petty vandalism. Youths looking for a thrill would break the windows or spray graffiti on the walls. The dog barked furiously whenever they approached, as if defending the remains of a sanctuary. Despite his size, he managed to deter many from causing more damage. Late at night, he'd roam the perimeter, always returning to the stoop with anxious glances over his shoulder, ensuring that no intruder had come to disturb the front entrance. And so the pattern endured. Each day was a carbon copy of the last, with the dog's unwavering vigilance overshadowed by the dreadful possibility that his wait might be in vain. Yet he refused to give up. He clung to the faintest glimmer of hope, a beacon shining through the darkest nights, as though a cord bound him to his master's promise. "I'll be back soon." Those words, whether truly spoken or imagined, were everything to him. Fifth year. By now, the entire neighborhood knew him. The mail carrier started leaving extra biscuits on the route, dropping them gently by the bottom step whenever the dog looked up at him. The crossing guard from the nearby school came by on Sunday mornings to fill his water bowl with fresh, cool water. A small community had formed around him, those who empathized with his unbreakable spirit. Local families sometimes proposed adopting him, but inevitably any attempt to move him away brought the same heartbreaking reaction: terror, heartbreak, resistance. One glance at the road, a single memory, and he would scramble back to that step, paws skidding on the cracked cement, heart pounding as if he feared the greatest betrayal would be to leave. During the long nights of the sixth year, often heard him howling in the dark. It was a forlorn, soulful sound, piercing the quiet streets. Some nights, she'd sit on her own porch, tears slipping down her cheeks as she listened. She'd think about Aaron, the rumored man who once lived there. She tried searching online, combing through hospital records or news stories. She found no definitive leads. His name was too common, and she lacked further details. The dog's story seemed suspended in a haze of uncertainty, no closure, no revelation. As the seventh year loomed, signs of aging on the dog became obvious. His gait slowed, a noticeable limp appearing in his rear leg. His coat had lost its luster. The eyes that once gleamed with anxious anticipation were cloudier, as though time had layered sorrow upon sorrow. Yet his resolve did not waver. Even with a limp, he would hobble to the edge of the porch at sunrise, scanning the empty road. Each passing car caused him to perk up momentarily, only to slump in disappointment when it rumbled on without stopping. It was around this period that a mysterious letter arrived in his mailbox. The paper looked old, edges torn as though handled carelessly or stored in a damp place. She opened it curiously, only to find a few scrawled lines that read, "The man who lived there, I think I saw him once in a care facility. He suffered a traumatic brain injury." No name was signed, no return address. The letter ended abruptly. His heart pounded. Was this real or just another rumor? She visited nearby care facilities, even traveling out of the county, speaking to administrators, caretakers, and social workers. She came up empty-handed, but it stirred something in her. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the dog's vigil was not in vain. Perhaps his owner was alive, trapped in a state of incapacitation, unaware that a faithful companion still awaited him. Time, indifferent and steady, pressed into the eighth year. The dog's presence had become a local legend, an emblem of unwavering loyalty. Schools used his story to teach children about compassion and devotion. Journalists wrote short columns about him in the local paper from time to time, but his plight never went truly viral. It remained largely a poignant tale contained within the borders of this quiet, worn-down neighborhood. A handful of well-intentioned folks had posted photos on social media, hoping to find his owner. But the internet is vast and unforgiving. The dog's story drowned in a sea of other heartbreaks and short-lived fascinations. During the winters, noticed he had a harder time walking on icy ground. Arthritic pain seemed to grip his joints. She and a few caring neighbors pooled money to purchase soft orthopedic bedding, placing it near the porch's entry where he loved to lie. They kept the area clean and well-insulated. Still, the dog often woke up stiff, limping around with a faint whine that tore at the heart. Tried over-the-counter supplements, even approaching local vets who recommended pain relievers. Occasionally, the dog accepted them when hidden in a morsel of meat. But the heartbreak lingered in his eyes, a persistent yearning that no medication could soothe. And yet, Through all the accumulating hardship, he waited. The habit was ingrained into his soul, deeper than survival instincts. He would creep slowly, day by day, to the threshold, sniff the air, and peer down the empty driveway as though expecting a miracle. On certain mornings, he'd let out a soft bark as though calling, "Where are you?" Silence was his only reply. Nearing the 9th year, a sense of foreboding wrapped the house. The roof was caving in. The porch steps were once again dangerously worn. Thick vines choked the shutters. Nature was reclaiming the building. One rainy afternoon, part of the gutter tore free from the rotted eaves and fell with a thunderous crash. The dog startled, scrambling to his feet, barking into the downpour. He stood there, drenched, sides heaving, and it was as if he expected his owner to appear in the gloom. When no one came, he let out a trembling sigh and slowly limped back to his usual spot. In the midst of this sorrow, a kind of quiet wonder took root. There was a depth to his devotion that transcended logic. Whenever one of the neighbors gazed into his eyes, they saw not mere stubbornness, but a testament to something far rarer, a love unblemished by betrayal or broken promises. The dog had made his choice, and nothing in the world could dissuade him. Then, in the beginning of the 10th year, something shifted. A rumor circulated that the property would be demolished. It was unsafe, an eyesore, and the city had finally gathered the funds to tear it down. Panic rippled through the neighborhood. Was the first to raise concerns with local officials. She pleaded, "You can't just bulldoze the place while this dog is there. It will traumatize him or worse." The city officials listened politely but responded with bureaucratic finality. The building was a hazard. It needed to come down. The scheduled date was set for 3 weeks away. A storm of worry and the neighbors who cared. They had to move the dog now. He was older, more fragile, but there was no alternative. Leaving him there during demolition was unimaginable. Tried something new. She sat with him each day, speaking in gentle tones, placing her hand on his head. She recounted stories as though he could understand, stories about a safe place where he could rest and be cared for. The dog wagged his tail, leaning into her warmth. Yet whenever she tried to guide him off the porch, the same fear flooded his eyes. Finally, 2 weeks before demolition, the rescue team returned, this time better prepared. They brought a crate lined with soft blankets, an array of treats, and a tranquilizer that could help ease the dog's anxiety. Stood by, tears in her eyes, torn between relief that he would be safe and heartbreak that his unwavering vigil might end against his will. The plan was straightforward. Get close enough to administer a mild sedative and a treat, wait for him to become drowsy, then gently lift him into the crate. Everyone feared the dog might panic, but after a decade, age and weariness weighed heavily on him. When he ate the tranquilizer-laced treat, his body relaxed. A fleeting sadness crossed his features, as though he sensed the finality. They carefully carried him into the rescue van, closed the door, and drove away from the only home he had ever known. Followed in her car, eyes wet, a hollow ache in her chest. She prayed he would forgive them for breaking his vigil. They placed him in a foster home, a safe, warm place with a fenced yard. The woman who ran the foster program was gentle and patient. She gave him space, letting him adjust on his own terms. The dog would stare at the door, often whining softly, pressing his nose to the glass window as though searching for that familiar front porch step. In his dreams, he'd sometimes jerk awake with a pained bark. Each time would shuffle in quietly, speaking reassuring words, stroking his frail body until he settled. The sadness in his eyes never fully lifted, but at least he was sheltered from the elements. With consistent, nourishing meals, his weight stabilized slightly. His limp remained and he moved slowly, but he was safe. Days later, the old house was torn down. The rumble of machinery, the crash of timber and brick, turned that place into a pile of rubble. Some neighbors watched from a distance, tears in their eyes. Couldn't bear to look, afraid that the dog might somehow sense it happening, that his unwavering faith might shatter in a jarring, cosmic sense of loss. But she knew it was necessary. The structure was too dangerous to remain standing. The dog in his foster home paced by the windows during that demolition day. He barked faintly as though calling out across the miles, "I'm still here. Where are you?" Even, who had seen her fair share of rescues, found herself crying as she tried to console him. She whispered, "I'm so sorry," though she wasn't quite sure to whom she was apologizing. The dog, the absent owner, or the universe itself for letting such loyalty go unrewarded. In the following weeks, local chatter about the demolition died down. Life moved forward as it always does. But in the back of their minds, the neighbors carried a lingering sorrow for the dog. He continued living with, quiet and often lost in his own world. She took him for short walks in her backyard, coaxing him to explore. Sometimes he, sniffing the grass. More often he simply sat by the door, ears drooping. He would tilt his head at each passing car, his eyes flickering with a poignant longing. Then something strange happened. A local volunteer who worked part-time at the county records office came across a mention of a man named Aaron whose last known address matched the demolished house. The mention included a note, "Patient at Rehabilitation Center, Southeastern District." The volunteer mentioned it too, who nearly dropped the phone in shock. Rehabilitation Center was nearly 3 hours away, a small, specialized facility for long-term care. Immediately, hopped into her car and drove there. Heart pounding, she explained to the front desk that she was searching for a man who might have been living in her neighborhood years ago. The staff hesitated due to privacy concerns, but pleaded her case, describing the dog's story in trembling detail, tears threatening to spill. Touched by her sincerity, the facility's director finally relented enough to say that they did have a patient named Aaron with the same last name as the records indicated. He had been there for almost a decade, suffering from severe brain trauma that left him largely unresponsive. His heart thundered. She asked to see him, explaining that she was trying to reunite him with someone who had waited all this time. At first they refused, citing policies, but after witnessing desperation and verifying she was not there for any nefarious reason, they allowed a supervised visit. The moment stepped into Aaron's room, a wave of emotion struck her. He lay in a bed, propped up slightly, eyes half open. Machines hummed softly, tubes and monitors wrapped around him like a silent fortress. His expression was distant, lost in a reality that might not include the present moment. Found herself choking back sobs. She softly explained why she was there, not sure if he could understand. There was no visible reaction, no sign of recognition. She showed him a photograph on her phone, one the neighbors had taken of the dog on that porch. Aaron's gaze flickered, but it might have been involuntary. She couldn't be certain. His arms rested limp at his sides. After the visit, confronted the staff. Could they allow a dog on the premises? Might it spark something in Aaron? The director was kind but cautious. The facility had strict hygiene and safety policies. They rarely allowed any animals aside from registered therapy dogs. Still, kept pleading, tears in her eyes. She recounted every detail. How the dog had never left the porch, how it had been 10 years of unwavering fidelity, and how maybe, just maybe, a reunion could spur something miraculous. In a turn that felt almost fated, the director finally agreed to a one-time supervised visit, provided the dog was up to date on vaccinations and presented no risk. Left with a trembling heart, unsure if the dog would even remember Aaron's scent or if Aaron would register the dog's presence. But hope, fragile yet bright, flared within her. She rushed to his home, explaining everything in an excited rush. Stared, astonished, her own eyes misty. Could this be the moment the dog had waited for all these years? They arranged the necessary paperwork, got medical clearances for the dog, and carefully planned the trip. A volunteer from the rescue group offered to drive the crate in a van, ensuring the dog was comfortable during the 3-hour journey. Finally, the day arrived. They placed the dog in the crate, loaded into the van, and followed the winding road toward. During the drive, the dog lay still, his eyes distant, as though everything he had known was behind him. Sat beside him, hand resting near the crate's door, whispering words of encouragement. He stared back, not fully understanding, but perhaps sensing her gentle reassurance. At the staff cleared a small, private visiting area, carefully prepping for the dog's arrival. Aaron was wheeled in by two nurses and placed in a reclining wheelchair. His head drooped slightly, and his eyes remained half-lidded. Machines still accompanied him, beeping softly, a reminder of his fragile condition. The dog was trembling, likely from the unfamiliar setting, the antiseptic smells, the hushed hum of machinery. Coaxed him forward, letting him walk on his own. He limped across the gleaming tiled floor, sniffing anxiously at the sterile air. He paused a few feet away from Aaron's wheelchair, head tilted, as though uncertain. He glanced back at him, searching for reassurance, then took a few more hesitant steps. Silence stretched in the room, broken only by the rhythmic beeps of the monitors. The dog sniffed the edge of the wheelchair, his tail low, posture tentative. Then, gently, as though guided by recognition of something deeper than smell, the dog nudged Aaron's leg with his muzzle. It was a tender, almost reverent motion, like one giving thanks after a long and perilous journey. Aaron's face gave the slightest twitch. His eyes, half-focused, stared straight ahead. The dog whined, stepping closer, sniffing at Aaron's hand. For a split second, like a fragile whisper in the void, Aaron's fingers twitched. A fleeting spark seemed to pass through him. The nurse, wide-eyed, placed a hand on Aaron's wrist, checking for any further sign. Nothing else happened. But that single moment hung in the air, charged with meaning. In that stillness, the dog pressed his head against Aaron's knee, letting out a soft, broken sound that seemed to contain a decade of longing, heartbreak, and unwavering devotion. Those watching felt tears sliding down their cheeks. It was as if the dog, in that moment, recognized his person. Even if Aaron did not, or could not, respond, the dog's posture was full of gentleness and relief. Despite everything, 10 years of waiting, heartbreak, and unanswered questions, here they were, in the same room, sharing the same air. A reunion that the boundaries of logic and rational expectation. For a few minutes, it seemed like a miracle might occur. The dog kept nuzzling Aaron's hand, offering tender licks, but Aaron remained largely unresponsive. The nurse checked him carefully, ensuring his vitals were stable, and watched with pounding hearts, torn between joy and sorrow. Was the dog finally free to understand that Aaron hadn't abandoned him willingly? Or would he leave this encounter even more broken, sensing that his beloved owner was locked away in a place beyond reach? As the visit ended, they gently coaxed the dog away, noticing how he resisted, pawing gently at Aaron's wheelchair. The staff promised to consider future visits if it seemed beneficial, and thanked them repeatedly, tears glistening in their eyes. They led the dog back toward the van. His steps were heavier this time, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. Over the next few weeks, they returned several times. Each visit followed a similar pattern. The dog would approach Aaron, nuzzle him, and let out a soft whine. Aaron's expression rarely changed, though staff reported subtle fluctuations in his heart rate whenever the dog was in the room. It was a small sign, a whisper of recognition in the silent chamber of his mind. The doctors admitted it was unusual but did not promise any breakthroughs. Traumatic brain injuries can be unpredictable. Some see slow improvement. Others remain unchanged indefinitely. Still, the dog's spirit seemed lighter after the visits, as though a missing puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. He grew calmer. Though he still limped, he appeared less burdened by that sorrowful gaze. As if he understood that Aaron was not gone by choice, that his loyalty had, in fact, been rewarded in the quiet knowledge. He's still here, and he never wanted to leave me. But time is merciless. The dog was old, having endured a harsh decade of waiting. His health had never been robust. The years of exposure, poor shelter, and minimal medical care took their toll. One chilly morning, noticed he wouldn't rise from his bed. He lay there, breathing heavily, pain etched across his features. She rushed him to the local vet, trailing behind in her car, both terrified that it might be too late. The prognosis was grave. Kidney failure, coupled with severe arthritis and a possible infection. The vet offered a range of treatments, but was clear that recovery was uncertain due to his advanced age and years of wear and tear. And hearts-shattering, agreed to do whatever they could to keep him comfortable. They visited daily, bringing blankets and familiar toys, hoping to spark his spirit. He'd perk up at the sight of them, managing a weak tail wag, but his eyes often glazed over with pain. Then, on a quiet afternoon, the vet made a gentle suggestion. The dog's suffering was mounting, and there was no guarantee that further interventions would bring lasting relief. Clung to hope for a miracle, tears slipping down her face as she sat beside the dog in the back room of the clinic. His voice broke as she whispered, "He's given so much, we have to think about what he needs, not what we want." Nodded, her throat closing. Love at times requires letting go. In one final act of compassion, the vet agreed to let the dog have a short trip too. Arrangements were made quickly. Some staff recognized the extraordinary nature of the request, but they approved it under palliative compassion guidelines. The dog was on pain medication, comfortable enough to travel, and gingerly carried him into the van, lying on a cushioned bed. He rested his muzzle on his lap, breathing shallowly, eyes flickering with an unspoken gratitude, or perhaps relief that he would see Aaron once more. They arrived at. Aaron was already in the visiting room, leaning in the same wheelchair, eyes distant. The nurses and the director stood aside, respectfully quiet, and gently placed the dog close to Aaron. He lifted his head with effort, gazing at the man he had waited for so faithfully. A soft whine escaped his throat. He placed his paw on Aaron's footrest. Aaron's eyes fluttered. There was that faint muscle twitch around his mouth, as if he sensed something familiar. For a fleeting moment, time seemed to melt. The dog closed his eyes, pressing his head against Aaron's knee. One of the nurses let out a sob, muffling it behind her hand. Bit her lip until she tasted blood, tears streaming down her face. Shoulders shook with silent grief. There was a hush in the room, a trembling stillness charged with 10 years of heartbreak, longing, and the smallest thread of hope. In that stillness, Aaron's hand moved, very slightly but undeniably. His fingers twitched against his wheelchair's armrest. It could have been random. It could have been reflex. But in that room, it felt like a gentle benediction, a silent acknowledgement of a bond that transcended words. The dog gave one last, weak wag of his tail as if to say, "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." Moments later, the dog's body relaxed. His shallow breaths grew fainter, spaced out. Pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Crouched next to him, whispering, "It's okay, you can rest now." The dog let out a final exhale, a soft sigh that seemed to carry a decade's worth of devotion and patience. His body went still, paw still resting near Aaron's foot. Silence crushed the room. One of the nurses turned away, tears in her eyes. The director, who had witnessed many difficult moments, held a trembling hand over his heart. Gently cradled the dog's head, her tears dripping onto his fur. It was peaceful, if heartbreaking, a loyal guardian finally releasing his watch. In the weeks that followed, the staff reported that Aaron's condition remained the same. There was no miraculous recovery, no sudden awakening. But they also noted that occasionally, when the gentle therapy dog made rounds, Aaron's heart rate would spike momentarily, as if searching for something that no longer existed in this world. Perhaps he sensed a memory, long buried, of a faithful companion who had never given up on him. Arranged a small memorial for the dog back in the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered in the vacant lot where the old house once stood, now just a patch of dirt and sparse grass. They spoke in hushed, broken voices of the dog's unwavering loyalty, the lessons he had taught them about devotion, hope, and the silent power of love that endures beyond reason. A simple stone was placed, engraved with the words, "Forever waiting, forever loved." Word of the dog's story spread quietly, not with the explosive force of viral fame, but with a softer, more enduring resonance. People who heard it felt something shift within them, a recognition of the rare kind of love that stands steadfast in the face of all doubt. Some cried, imagining what it must be like to wait 10 years for someone who might never return. Others felt an aching admiration, a longing to be so wholeheartedly devoted to something in their own lives. Over time, the lot where the house once stood was eventually bought, and a new home rose from the dirt, modern and sleek, populated by a young family. They'd heard the story of the dog who waited and placed a small plaque by the porch steps, inscribed with a single word: loyalty. It became a quiet tradition to lay flowers there every spring. Visited Erin from time to time, though her visits became less frequent. Each time she brought a photo of the dog, propped it up on the stand beside his bed, and spoke softly about that final day. She didn't know if he could understand, but she wanted him to know that his friend had been there until the very end, fulfilling a promise neither could truly put into words. In the end, the dog's story lived on in whispered recollections, in memories of a decade spent on a peeling porch, in the hearts of everyone who witnessed an unbreakable bond that abandonment and time. Some say that on certain chilly mornings, if you stand at the corner of that street, you can almost sense a presence, a faint wag of a tail on the breeze, an echo of paws against old wood, as though he still keeps his silent watch, not in sorrow, but in quiet triumph, having proven that love can outlast separation, hardship, and even death. No one can truly say what the dog felt during those long years of waiting, what visions passed through his mind as he stared down the empty road. But what remains is the undeniable reality that he waited, day after day, year after year. And in the end, he found his person, if only for a moment of final goodbye. His vigil stands as a testament to the kind of loyalty that humbles the human heart, reminding us that sometimes the strongest bonds need no words, and that even in heartbreak lies a profound beauty worth sharing and remembering. And so, whenever someone in that quiet neighborhood recounts the tale, they close with a mixture of tears and a soft, reverent hush. This dog waited 10 years for its owner, and what happened next was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. A love like that does not vanish with time or darkness. It burns brightly, lighting the way for anyone who dares to hope, to dream, and to wait, no matter how long it takes.